So this video is mostly going to be just kind of a reference for myself, as well as something to apply to a portfolio in case I do end up with a job that requires some sort of, I guess, proof that I can work on computers, whatever types of jobs this might be, whether it be IT or something else. Anyways, so a couple months back, me and my friend were talking about upgrading an Intel iMac because she essentially wanted to start using the computer for video editing and she wants to get into marketing. So I said, okay, no problem, we can definitely do that. We started discussing about what sort of upgrades would need to be done on the computer in order to make it worthwhile, so that way she can actually use it. And in this video, I'm going to be pretty much going over the entire process I went through in order to upgrade this computer and install Sonoma. Disclaimer: nothing I do in this video or talk about in this video should you do unless you feel you also have the knowledge and skills to do it. There have been many times throughout this project where I thought I'd killed the computer. You do not want to be that guy. Especially since this isn't even my computer, this computer belongs to my friend. So I had to make sure that I was doing things as proper as I can to make sure I was giving her the computer back in one piece. So once again, disclaimer, do at your own risk, and I'm hoping that potentially some of the things I went through in this process could help someone else out in the future should they stumble upon this video and be facing a similar problem. So once again, the first thing we were doing is planning ideas, bringing up ideas, planning how this was all going to go, what sort of upgrades I was going to be doing in order to get the computer up and running again. Well, it's not even that the computer wasn't running, it's just that we wanted it to be running faster and better, specifically because she was going to be doing things like video editing, possible Photoshop, music and stuff like that. We wanted this to be as fast as it could be. So at the beginning, we started with a 2010 27-inch iMac. I believe the specs for it were an i5, what was it, a 680, I believe, an i5 680. It had 4 gigs of RAM, 2 of which were dead. It had an HD, what was it, 5750, and it had a 500 gig hard disk. So at the time when that computer released, I believe those were decent specs, and they probably were really good for the time when it released. But over time, obviously, those parts are not really considered that great. I mean, first gen Intel Core products, I believe that one only had 4-core, 4-thread, or I might even be wrong, it might be dual core, I'm not too sure. But we wanted to start working on it to get it to be as fast as we can, and the specs just weren't going to cut it. Running that computer with only 2 gigs of RAM available because half of the 4 gigs had died was not great. So the way this whole thing kind of jump-started, we were talking about this for a good couple months. We were slowly planning it out, but it got jump-started because my friend had to move, and during the move, I had asked some of my friends to help us with some of the stuff, and one of my friends unfortunately dropped the iMac and smashed the screen. Wait, hold on 1 second. Oh shit. Alright, now that my notifications are off, again, so we were moving her stuff out of her apartment and my friend had dropped the iMac and the screen had smashed. And she was asking me if it was still salvageable. She was really worried that the iMac had died. It had very sentimental value to her, and she didn't want to let go of it. So I got to work on starting to see if the screen was broken and if the iMac was still recoverable. Thankfully, it was just the glass panel in front of the screen that was smashed. The screen itself was still good, and the iMac still worked. So everything was fine and dandy. After that, we started talking a bit more about specs, and I was talking about how I really wanted at least minimum 2nd gen Intel, and I was doing some research, and I found out that the last upgradable iMac was the iMac 2011, and that supported second gen Intel. So I used the opportunity to browse around Facebook Marketplace, and I found one that someone had assumed was broken, an iMac 2011 27-inch that someone said was broken. So I purchased it for 30 Canadian dollars. The only issue, there were two issues with it, but they were both easily solvable. The first issue was that there was no operating system, and that was because the drive inside the machine had died. Very easy fix. We just swapped the hard drive from the 2010 into the 2011, and all seemed fine. Now, the second issue that was present in this machine was that the graphics card had died. And as you guys know, the 2011s were notorious for having their graphics cards die. Those graphics cards, the HD 6000 series from ATI, I'm pretty sure a lot of people remember just how bad they were and how often they failed. I revived it. I revived that card by baking it in the oven for about 10 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and I let it cool in the oven as well with the door open for 30 minutes. I only opened the door a little bit, I didn't open it all the way, so I could retain as much heat as possible to ensure that all the solder joints rebinded. After baking the GPU, the iMac was working, graphics were working, it booted properly, I was able to see everything, and it was finally time to start getting to work on the upgrading process. So, first order of business was we wanted to upgrade the RAM because the other iMac also only came with 2 gigs of RAM. So that was a total of 4 gigs, which is ideally what it would have started with from the get-go, but due to a RAM stick dying, there was only 2 gigs. 4 still wasn't that great. We decided that, no, it needed to be something better than that if she was going to be using it on a daily basis for work. I managed to find DDR3 SODIMMs, 1333 megahertz, 16 gigs, 4 sticks on Facebook Marketplace for, I believe I spent another $30, which wasn't bad. So I got 4 sticks, 4 entire sticks, all matching. And we slapped them in. Immediately the system felt a lot more responsive, things were loading quicker, the system was booting faster, so everything was looking positive. And we decided the next upgrade in the series would be the CPU. By doing the CPU upgrade, I figured it would also kind of just help in general, since we wanted to go from 4-core 4-thread to 4-core 8-thread. And so that's exactly what we did. I went on Marketplace once again, and I found an i7 2600. I purchased it. The seller sold it to me for $20 Canadian. This was the first time I hadn't opened the iMac properly. And this is, again, where my disclaimer comes in: do at your own risk. I was very terrified opening this machine. One, because of the exposed power supply. That thing can hold charge for a while and can kill you if you are not careful. And 2, because I had never worked with an iMac before. So the layout was extremely unfamiliar to me. I was unsure about all the cables on the front and the back that I knew Apple had hidden around the machine. This was my first experience actually getting into it and getting nitty-gritty with the machine. CPU upgrade was fairly standard for a computer. You just take the latch off, pop the hood, take out the old one, pop in the new one, slam it back down, use force on the lever, standard computer CPU install for LGA style CPUs. After that was done, I put the computer back together as best as I could. I was really scared that I might have forgotten something, but I surprisingly hadn't forgotten anything, and all of the components were plugged in and everything booted, and the computer turned on just fine. So I considered it a success right there. Computer booted fine, computer automatically felt snappier once again after both a RAM and CPU upgrade. And I ran a couple stress tests to make sure everything was stable. I ran Signbench, I ran Geekbench. I even went ahead and downloaded Valley and Heaven just to see what GPU performance was like on the 6970 that was in 2011. And it wasn't great. It wasn't great at all. So once again, confirming that we needed to do a GPU upgrade if she wished to be using this for work. But the first order of business before we decided on the most expensive component was we wanted to decide on the storage she was going to use. An SSD was out of the question. We had to get an SSD. We were not going to be getting another hard disk drive in a larger size. The main thing we were talking about back and forth was if she needed 500 gigs or if she needed a terabyte. And in the end, we settled on a 1 terabyte Crucial MX500. I picked that up on sale for 65 Canadian dollars. And I decided to save that for the end simply because I wanted to do a fresh install of Sonoma on the system, then bring the data over later. So by this point, everything was looking great, and we had to start planning on the GPU. That was the final thing that needed to be done. Well, not the final thing, but the final upgrade in terms of hardware. So I was debating on getting a Quadro originally. I was really heavily leaning towards the K5100 from NVIDIA. But in the end, I ended up finding a really good deal on a WX7100 from AMD. And reading on the forums, a lot of people were saying that it is probably one of the most compatible cards that you can throw into one of these machines. So I decided, it was worth biting the cost for. I think I spent 260 Canadian dollars on it. And that came with its own slew of issues because I was still learning a lot and I was still reading through forums on how to do certain things. But we'll get into that in a second. So after I did that, after I purchased the GPU, during the time I was waiting for the GPU, I got started with OpenCore because I wanted to start configuring the system to be ready for when it was time to start installing it. So I downloaded OpenCore. I set up the EFI partition on the main drive because I wanted to start, or the old 500 gig HDD because I wanted to start working on getting EFI boot. I wanted to start messing around with the settings to see what there was and what was necessary to do in order to get it to work. Everything seemed pretty straightforward, except one main setting that I forgot about at some point was the AMD GOP injection, which with certain cards is required in order to light up the screen. Natively, most cards will not work with the iMac simply because they do not have an Apple vBios flashed onto them. So I had to go, after the GPU came in, I had to go onto the online forums of Mac Rumors. I'm going to leave a link to that, to the entire GPU upgrade thread. I had to go onto that forum and I had to do a lot of researching my card in particular and specific problems that came with my specific model of iMac. Now, the first order of business when the GPU arrived was I had to purchase a programming clip. This is one of these claw clip programmers with the contacts in the teeth here, made for programming, and I used the program AsProgrammer to do this. I had downloaded a vBios off of the repository of iMac vBioses that are. There is a link in the forum to that repository. I might also add this to my video as well if necessary, but I don't think it is. I went ahead and I downloaded a what was it? It was the EG2 GOP vBios, and I flashed it onto the WX7100. And after I did that, here's where I had another problem. I still had no display on the screen after installing it. And the reason was, this is with High Sierra in particular. For whatever reason, the display will not turn on. unless you do a hardwire mod. First things first, obviously OpenCore needs to be set up correctly to use the GOP vBios, which is where the AMD GOP injection comes in. That is a very important setting when it comes to using these vBioses on these cards. So you have to make sure you have that enabled before you build and install OpenCore to your drive. But the second issue was that my screen was on, but I had no backlight. So for a little bit, I had to use a second monitor in order to see the screen. And that was when I came across on that same iMac GPU thread, someone had brought up a hardwire mod, or a hot wire, whatever you want to call it, hardwire, hot wire. He described that he found out that on the inverter board, there were 2 pins that if you connected them, the backlight would light up again with native brightness control. Although I still didn't have an EFI boot screen with the WX7100. I only had the OpenCore boot. When it came to soldering on the inverter board, I might take a picture of this and edit it into the video just so that way you can get a cleaner look at it, but you are supposed to solder the 2 top pins on the board over here as per what the forum said. I'm not entirely sure if that is what needed to be done with this board, because there are multiple different models of inverter boards, and I accidentally seem to have killed this one in doing so. Now, again, I'm not entirely sure why this happened, but I know for sure it has something to do with the fact that I killed it. Me going on to soldering on it, I had to go and grab the inverter from the 2010 iMac, and I plopped it into the 2011 iMac, and I redid the hot wire mod a second time. This time I was extremely careful. I had to solder the 2 cables. It was a different model than this one. It was a completely different inverter from this one. It looks very similar, but some of these are in different places on the board. What you're supposed to do is you are supposed to solder both PWM and BL on together. Those are the names of the pins, PWM and BL on. And after you solder those 2 together, you will have your backlight once again, as long as you have AMD GOP injection enabled in the Core EFI settings. So once again, I accidentally killed this inverter. Once again, these are things you do at your own risk. I was only lucky that I had a spare board from another computer, from another iMac, that was not working. And a lot of people might not be that fortunate. So please, if you do attempt this, be very cautious, be very careful, do a lot of research. Once again, this was a different model than the one that came with the 2010. And the mod worked on the 2010 inverter board, but not with the 2011 inverter board. Another thing to note as well is inside these iMacs on the logic board, there are 4 LEDs that are used for diagnostics. LED 1 is trickle power, which pretty much tells you that the iMac is receiving power from the outlet. LED 2 signifies power on. That LED signifies that the system is turning on and is receiving full power and it is actively awake. LED 3 signifies GPU. You don't need LED 3 to turn on. When it comes to doing any sort of GPU swap, LED 3 may not turn on and you may still get a display. So if LED 3 is not on, please be mindful. There is a very high chance that your GPU is still working, but it's not turning on because your system does not recognize it as a proper GPU. And again, you're using OpenCore to kind of bridge that gap where Apple has tried to stop it. And last but not least, LED 4 is display on. That LED only turns on when the display is working correctly. It does not check for backlight, but as long as the display is actually outputting signal, that LED will turn on. So once again, trickle power is LED 1, power on is LED 2, GPU OK is LED 3 on hold once again. GPU OK does not necessarily mean that your card is not working if it doesn't turn on, so be very mindful of that. And LED 4 is video OK, screen OK. Now, one thing to note with High Sierra in particular after the hardwire mod is that the screen does not come to life automatically. The Mac Rumors forums have pinned this as an Apple bug, but I think it's more so that Apple tried to stop GPU upgrades in High Sierra, since that is the last known officially supported operating system that works on these computers. So I myself, my headcanon is that Apple has decided to put a patch somewhere that if the computer detects a non-standard GPU that is not Apple signed, it turns the screen off. Now, this is very confusing for a lot of people because your screen is on and then suddenly it's off as soon as the drivers for High Sierra take over. The only way I was able to get the display back was to either use a second monitor via the display ports on the back, the mini display ports, but I didn't really like that because I don't have a lot of space to work with, so I used a mini display port emulator stick. And what this does is, this is essentially an active chip that tells the computer there is something connected to the display port, and by doing that, I was able to re-enable the screen. However, every time I booted the computer using High Sierra, this stick needed to be installed. And in order to stop any confusion of a second display actually being run, I went ahead into the display properties and I set it to mirror the screens. So the emulator stick was receiving the same signal that the internal screen was giving off. So both screens were the same, even though I didn't have a second screen. As far as the computer was concerned, they were the same, and I was able to proceed without having to worry about the computer actually trying to hook to a second screen and me losing my mouse. After I confirmed that the GPU was working in High Sierra, I ran, again, some more benchmarks. This time I ran the GPU benchmarks Heaven and Valley, just to make sure that it was working. One thing I noticed with the vBioses that I had installed onto the card is that the one of the GOP EG2 vBioses that I put onto the WX7100, it changed the name of the card, which is not a big issue at all. It's reporting as an RX480, which the WX7100 is running the same chip as an RX480. I believe it is pretty much the same. It is the same architecture and it is running the same memory configuration. So I was able to use that vBIOS on the iMac, despite the fact that the card is a different card. The WX7100 is optimized more for work, whereas the RX480 is optimized more for gaming. But that is okay. To me, as long as it was working and I had AG2 as well as GPO, I was okay. And so at this point, it was time to start messing around with OpenCore once again, because the last thing we wanted to do with this computer was to install a new operating system, which Apple has also disallowed on these older machines. So right away, my biggest issue at the beginning was because I had a non-standard card that was also modified, I had no boot picker, no native boot picker on the iMac. So when I set up the OpenCore USB with all the correct settings, once again, make sure your OpenCore settings are correct when before you go and build and install to the USB. You need to make sure you have GOP injection turned on for your respective brand. There is both an option for NVIDIA and an option for AMD. Just to make sure I had a bit more compatibility, I went ahead and I turned on GPU spoofing and I set it to spoof a Polaris card. Now this is not the reason why the card was reporting as an RX 480. The card was reporting as an RX 480 before I turned on spoofing. And the last thing I did was I did SMBIOS spoofing at minimum, just to try and once again increase compatibility. So after I did that, I put in the USB and everything was going well. Except for the fact that after I took out the internal drive, I didn't have the USB set up, so I no longer had my OpenCore settings. And because I had a non-standard GPU, I also didn't have native boot picker. And now this is where another problem began. How was I supposed to select the OpenCore EFI on the USB if I didn't have a display to actually view it? I would be picking at the dark, which is quite frankly not fun. I tried that for about 30 minutes before I gave up and I decided to try something else. What I did was I took the 6970M that originally came with this computer and I reinstalled it back into it. Mind you, I did this lazily. I did it without the heatsink because I wanted to go in as fast as possible, and I also did it without unscrewing anything. I left the board in, I more or less just peeled it back a little bit and pulled out the old GPU. I didn't have anything screwed down, and right now my GPU in there is being held in with twist ties, which I would not recommend. I only did this because I was being lazy, but I do not recommend you be lazy when it comes to anything like this. So what I did, once again, I took the old GPU and I slotted it in without the heatsink, and I powered on the system. I have my native boot screen back, so I quickly used the boot picker to select the OpenCore EFI. But before I selected the OpenCore EFI, I pressed and held Control on the keyboard, and the reason why I did this is so that way the computer will always boot from that device from now on. And the reason why is just in case the Sonoma install fails, if I restart the system, it will boot into OpenCore all the time. After I had that set and after the Sonoma installer had opened, I quickly turned off the computer and removed the GPU before it overheated and died again. Because this is my only way back to the native Apple boot picker. And that would pose a very big problem if you didn't know how the OpenCore or the boot picker looked and you didn't know which side OpenCore EFI would appear on. Because I've seen it appear on both the left and the right of your main HDD or main drive. So that is something to be mindful of. Honestly, I would go ahead and I would set up the OpenCore EFI as boot before you do your GPU upgrade. However, I would make sure that you do the GPU upgrade before you install any operating system. And make sure as well that after you do your GPU upgrade, you set your settings correctly as well. So once again, create the OpenCore USB, make sure your settings are set correct before you insert the GPU, and then insert your GPU after you have the OpenCore EFI installed with the proper settings. After I got all that set and sorted, I went ahead and I popped in the 1TB SSD, and it was finally time to start installing Sonoma. I also popped back in the GPU because that's the GPU I wanted to use and I wanted to make sure that everything was fine. And I also wanted to make sure that the root patches that OpenCore installed were specific to the GPU I had installed. So I opened up the Sonoma installer, I turned on the computer, OpenCore showed up as it would. Again, there is no native boot screen. OpenCore is the one that closes the gap by providing an emulated boot screen. And then I selected the Sonoma installer. I went into disk utility and I formatted the SSD into APFS and I renamed it. And after I set it up, I went into the Sonoma install Sonoma's installed, did its thing on its own. Everything worked fine. The computer restarted about 4 to 5 times before Sonoma was finally giving me the user setup. Now, at this point, through the user setup, you do not want to migrate your data. You want to finish setting up the computer as a brand new computer before you try to migrate your data, because Migration Assistant is broken prior to reverting root patches. Sometimes even with root patches, Migration Assistant will be broken, so that's something to be mindful of as well. I believe on Sequoia, Migration Assistant is entirely broken, so if you are upgrading to Sequoia and you do want your data, what the forums on Mac Rumors suggest doing is to install Sonoma, get your data back. I'm going to get to that point soon, and then install Sequoia after getting your data back, just to make sure that you're getting all your stuff, because once again, the Sequoia Migration Assistant is broken with OpenCore. So I installed Sonoma, I did the computer setup, and after I did the computer setup, I made another mistake. I went ahead and I used Migration Assistant without reverting root patches, and the system got stuck with a permission symbol after reboot. And what that symbol is telling you is that it is detecting that the iMac is not compatible. It will not run on that system. I ended up going back into the Sonoma installer after I had done Migration Assistant, and I reinstalled my data again. Or I reinstalled Sonoma again. It went through the entire process again, the entire hour process of restarting, installing, restarting, installing, until I was eventually greeted with Migration Assistant being the first thing open as opposed to the user setup. And it got stuck. Migration Assistant got stuck. It remained on a spinning circle saying, please wait. In this instance, I waited about 30 minutes, nothing happened, so I just went ahead and I closed Migration Assistant. And after I closed Migration Assistant, I was finally greeted with a login screen for the user for the High install. I went ahead, I logged in, and everything seemed to be going great. Migration Assistant was working, or all the data seemed to have come through. Migration Assistant seemed to have worked. I went ahead. This is very important too. After you are done getting your data back, whether you had to reinstall Sonoma or not, or whatever operating system you decide to go with, the next thing you need to do is, afterwards, after you confirm your data is there, re-enable root patches and restart again. After you have restarted again, you are to go back to OpenCore, make sure you go to the settings again, set all the settings that you set on the USB as exactly as you have it on the USB. I haven't removed the USB at this point, so I was still booting OpenCore from the USB, but I was booting Sonoma off the disk, or the SSD. So at this point, I went ahead, I went into OpenCore, configured my settings again, making sure to enable AMD GOP injection, AMD Polaris spoofing, as well as minimal SMBIOS spoofing. And after I did that, then I went ahead and created the OpenCore and installed it to the SSD. And this is where I ran into the same boot picker issue of I can't see the boot picker. So for the last time, I had to open the iMac, pop this boy in again, and once again, I turned on the machine, I quickly got into the boot picker, I selected the OpenCore EFI that was on the SSD. You'll notice that it's on the SSD because the picture will show an NVMe drive on there, even though it's not an NVMe. You select the OpenCore EFI with the NVMe drive on it, and then it will proceed making sure to hold control. Once again, you need to hold control as you're doing that, so that way the computer will always boot from the OpenCore EFI. After I did that, Sonoma opened up, and I quickly turned the machine off again, because I did not want to fry the GPU running without a heatsink. So I took it apart. Again, I reinstalled the WX7100, closed it all back up once again, turned on the computer, OpenCore booted fine. I had my disk select, so I went ahead, I went into Sonoma again. Everything was fine, root patches were installed, all the files appeared to be there, dating all the way back to 2015. So by this point, I'd say that the install was a complete success. The machine had been successfully upgraded to Sonoma, as well as hardware upgrades. Once again, I'm going to go over them, just so that way you get an idea of what has transpired here. Again, there is an i7 2600, there is a 1 terabyte MX500 Crucial SSD, 1 terabyte. There is 16 gigs of 1333 megahertz RAM, and there is a WX7100 flashed as an RX 480, as well as a Sonoma install via OpenCore. And after everything, this was about a month's work of research and trying things. Some of these things I learned through the forums, some of these things I learned by myself. So there was a lot of trial and error, and once again, like I mentioned before, I've even killed something in the process of doing this. So please be very careful when doing anything like this, especially if you're going to the extent I did, where I swapped hardware around, because there is a possibility by swapping hardware you can kill something or kill everything. Not only that, but once again, because of the exposed power supply in these machines and how long they can hold onto juice, there is a very real risk of you injuring or killing yourself as well. So again, do at your own risk. If you are upgrading hardware, you risk hurting yourself, you risk damaging the hardware, or at the very worst, you even risk killing yourself. So with all that in mind, with that giant do at your own risk disclaimer, we finally arrive to the iMac powering on. There is the boot chime. I do not have the OpenCore boot picker enabled anymore because I just want it to start up from the same SSD every time. So as you can see, it looks like the iMac is booting as normal. There is no OpenCore boot picker. There is no Apple boot picker. Everything just goes as seamlessly as possible. The system boots right away straight into Sonoma. OpenCore opens, Sonoma opens, and the system powers on. Now, you can still access the OpenCore boot picker by pressing and holding escape on power. I can show you that real quick. I am just going to restart the machine just to show you. So at this point, the screen's off. You press and hold escape. And with OpenCore, you will get the boot picker, the OpenCore boot picker, so long as you are holding escape. So as you can see, there's the drive. I'm going to hold control and hit enter. So that way it always boots from that drive. OpenCore will now remember that drive and will always boot from that drive. The same way the Apple boot picker will remember what drive you select by holding control, the OpenCore boot picker will also remember what drive. And if you turn off the OpenCore boot picker, it will always start on that drive, making it as seamless of a boot as possible. And as you can see, the machine boots fairly quickly, considering this is a 2011 machine. Now, one thing is that the fans do ramp up to 100% out of the gate. I had to fix that using Max Fan. But that's okay. So there you have it. The machine is on. As you can see, I was messing around with it a little bit. I installed Steam because I wanted to go and play some games just to see what the GPU performance was on it. iMac is crying because I don't have my friend's no, I'm sorry, what is that? The Apple ID login stuff is going to complain because this computer has not been connected for a while. So all of my friends' passwords need to be signed in again, just to make sure that she can have all her features and stuff enabled again, like iMessage, iCloud. I'm not going to deal with that. I'm going to leave that for her to deal with because I'm not going to go and ask her for her passwords and stuff. No, I did not want system settings. I wanted about Mac. Sorry. So as you can see right here, about Mac. This is an iMac 27-inch mid 2011. It has a 3.4 gigahertz quad-core Intel Core i7. That is the 2600. It has an AMD Radeon RX 480 8GB. That is the WX7100. The FirePro WX7100 8GB. Flashed as an RX 480. It has 16 gigabytes of 1333 megahertz DDR3. It is booting from the SSD and is running on macOS Sonoma 14.7.6. I hope that this video can help someone else achieve a similar result if they are attempting to try and do as extensive upgrades as I have, because at this point, this machine is an entirely brand new computer. Not just because we jumped from a 2010 to a 2011, but as the 2011 stands, it also is an entirely new machine with an entirely new configuration that Apple has not created themselves. Everything's working, metal capable, GPU installed. With some of the OpenCore stuff, the GPU is handling some of the AVX2 stuff, so that's another thing to keep in mind. I will be disabling some of the visual effects that come with Sonoma just to improve performance a little more, just to take away a little bit of strain from potentially from CPU as well as GPU. Not that it really matters because the system is pretty snappy. Once again, if someone else is doing these upgrades and if someone else is willing to attempt to go this far and extensive, I'm really hoping that maybe some of the things I have explained in this video will help you out, and that hopefully you can get to a point where your 29 to 2011 iMac will have these upgrades and will have a new operating system, because these machines are not dead. Apple stopping support for these machines does not mean they are dead. Apple has decided that these machines are e-waste after they decide to stop supporting their last operating systems, but it doesn't have to be that way. These machines are capable of so much more and are capable of running these new operating systems for years to come. At the moment, it looks like macOS Tahoe might be the last operating system that you can use with OpenCore, simply because Apple has stated Tahoe will be the last Intel-based macOS. And that is a huge deal because after that, it's going to be a lot harder to crack the M-series chips that Apple likes to use in their products, and it is going to become very difficult to emulate that sort of stuff on things like Intel processors, since the M-series chips are entirely different from Intel processors with separate GPUs. I hope, again, this helps someone out. This video is mainly reference for myself and to add to my portfolio in case I can use this for job hunting. Thank you for watching, if you've gotten this far, and I really hope that anyone who tries this can have as much success as I have, and hopefully with this video will also take you less time than it took me, because once again, this was a month's worth of research and trying things over and over and over again until I finally reached a result that resulted in something moving forward, and I just had to keep moving forward with those results. And again, I was working on this pretty much day and night. If I wasn't at my vanilla job, I was here at home doing research, tinkering with the machine, trying all sorts of new things. I did not stop working on this machine. I would wake up, I would start working on it, I would go to work, I would come back home, and I would continue working on it for another couple hours before I went to bed and repeated the process again for a month straight. It was not fun. Well, I can't say it wasn't fun because it was kind of fun tinkering with it. Every time something worked, I felt a sense of euphoria. It felt great to be progressing forward. It felt great to know that I was going to be giving my friend an iMac that has pretty much been overhauled to a new generation. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.